Darkness. Cold, biting, thick like fog. Alice opens her eyes, feeling the cold metal of the floor sticking to her body. Her head is splitting with pain, pulsing in her temples. Barely lifting her head, she sees a faint beam from a flickering lamp swaying from the ceiling. Its light flickers, casting ghostly shadows on the walls, which are covered in peeling paint. Trying to move her arm sends a sharp pain through her. Looking down, Alice notices a rough bandage, sticky with something underneath. Blood. Her gaze sweeps across the room. An old mattress in the corner, torn at the edges. A wooden table with a cracked mirror, oddly redirecting the lamp's light, creating more ghostly reflections. A few cans sit on the table, torn labels rusting on the edges. Alice carefully pushes herself up, leaning against the wall. Her body shakes from weakness and fear. Above, faint creaking metal footsteps, slow, rhythmic, almost unintentionally threatening. The sound echoes as if from another world, but at the same time, it feels painfully close. She approaches the table, hoping to find something that will help her understand where she is. In the cracked mirror, her face looks unfamiliar. Dark circles under her eyes, tangled hair, pale skin. Behind her in the reflection, a dim map pinned to the wall. Alice moves closer to the map. It's covered in scribbled marks, each surrounded by strange lines and arrows. In the center, a large red X, labeled 0 point. Her heart starts pounding faster as she feels someone's gaze on her. The metal footsteps grow louder. They're no longer above her but closer, somewhere below in the same room. Suddenly, she hears the turn of a lock. The sound is heavy, grinding, as if it hasn't been opened in decades. The door creaks open, and a figure appears in the doorway. A middle-aged man with a piercing stare. His face is obscured by a half-mask, only his lips barely visible, moving as he speaks. "You're awake," he says, his voice low, calm, yet laced with an inexplicable coldness. "My name is Douglas." Alice can't find the words, only staring at him. "You're lucky I found you," he adds, stepping into the room. "You could have died out there in the chaos." "In the chaos?" she barely manages to squeeze out. Her voice trembles. Douglas nods, closing the door behind him. "The world isn't what it used to be. A chemical plant explosion wiped everything out. The air is poisoned. Down here, underground, you're safe." His words sound confident, but there's something else in his eyes, too watchful, like a predator studying its prey. Alice retreats to the wall, her gaze catching the map behind him. Her thoughts scatter, but one thing is clear. Something about this story doesn't add up. Douglas pauses for a moment, then adds, a faint smile creeping onto his lips. "Now you're dependent on me." Alice sat on the edge of the old mattress, holding a can of canned soup that Douglas had brought her. The metallic smell of blood from her bandaged arm mixed with the synthetic scent of the food, making her feel nauseous. Douglas sat in a chair by the table, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His gaze was fixed on her, and it made Alice feel as though she was under a microscope. "You have to understand," he said, swallowing dryly. "There's nothing left outside. We're among the few who survived." "But," Alice tried to ask, but he cut her off sharply. "No buts. The air out there is poisoned. If you go out, your skin will start burning, your lungs will burn up in seconds. It's horrible, but you have to trust me." He spoke the words with no emotion, but something in his tone gave Alice the chills. "And what happened? How did this happen?" she asked, trying to keep calm. Douglas looked away, as though thinking over his answer. "It was a chemical explosion, a sabotage. Everyone's dead, or they've turned into something that's hard to call human. They roam outside, searching for air that can't save them anymore." Alice felt her heart tighten at his words, but his evasive glance made her doubt him. He wasn't telling her the whole story. Later, alone in the room, she felt her thoughts blur into fragments of memories. Pieces of her past flashed in her mind. The bright lights of the newsroom, piles of documents on her desk, names she kept repeating to herself. Alice had been a journalist. Her last investigation had been about a series of kidnappings of young women in the city. She remembered how she'd felt she was getting close to something big when suddenly everything stopped. Does this have anything to do with what happened to me? She thought, clutching her head. That night, she was awoken by a sound. A dull, persistent knocking. It was coming from the door leading to the outside world. Knock! Knock! Alice got up, feeling the cold seep through her bones. She tried to sneak toward the door to get a better look, but within moments, Douglas entered the room. Don't go near it. His voice was so sharp that she froze in place. He rushed to the door, opened a small window in it, peered through, and suddenly slammed it shut with force. His face had changed. It was hard, almost beastly. It's them, he whispered. The victims. Don't you dare answer them. They wander, searching for air, but it won't save them. Alice felt her heart race in her chest. Who are they? She asked, barely swallowing her fear. Those who didn't manage to hide. You can't save them. They might hear you, and then they'll knock longer, until they break the door down. His words pierced her, but what frightened her more was how easily he spoke them. When Douglas left for the next room, Alice decided to search the mattress she had been sleeping on. Her fingers brushed against something hard. It was a small knife with a dull blade. What is this doing here? She slipped the knife into her pocket, her fingers gripping it tightly, as if it were her only chance at survival. I need to find out the truth, Alice decided, looking at the door leading into the unknown. Alice sat in the dim light of the lamp, gripping the small knife in her hand. She could barely hear Douglas leaving the room. His footsteps echoed heavily somewhere above. Her heart was pounding. She decided to seize the moment. Rising from the mattress, Alice began searching the room. Everything seemed old, worn out, but something about their arrangement unsettled her. She moved almost blindly, trying to make no sound. Her attention was drawn to a worn carpet in the corner of the room. The edges were frayed, as if it had been dragged across the floor countless times. Alice knelt and carefully lifted the edge of the carpet. She held her breath when she saw a metal plate beneath it, a hatch with a handle. It looked heavy and rusted. After a few attempts, she managed to lift it. The smell of dampness and decay hit her nose, making it hard to breathe. Beneath the hatch was another room. The light was dim, but Alice could make out piles of things scattered across the floor. Women's clothing, torn shoes, and a few books with crumpled pages. She slowly descended, trying not to scrape the rusted edges of the hatch. Her gaze stopped on one item, a small notebook with a dark cover. It was a journal. Opening it, Alice saw uneven handwriting. It seemed like the author had written in a panic. My name is Rachel. I don't know how long I've been here, but Douglas says it's for my own good. He says it's too dangerous outside, but I don't trust him anymore. I saw him. God, help me. Alice flipped through the pages, her heart tightening with each sentence. Other names appeared: Anna, Melanie, Sophie. They had all woken up in this very room, leaving behind similar entries. One of the last pages made her freeze. Douglas, he's not saving us. He's using us. It's all part of some sick plan. If you're reading this, run. He won't let you leave alive. Alice felt her hands begin to shake. She looked up and noticed a strange diagram drawn on one of the walls. It resembled a map, but not a geographical one. It was a layout of rooms, spaces, and dates. All of them were crossed out except one, her room. Returning upstairs, she closed the hatch and quickly placed the carpet over it. But before she could step away, she heard the heavy footsteps of Douglas. The door swung open with such a bang that Alice nearly jumped. What were you doing? His voice was cold and firm. His gaze pierced through her. Nothing, I was just checking the room, she answered, trying to stay calm. Douglas stepped closer, his face darkening. He leaned over to the cracked mirror on the wall and, seemingly by accident, ran his hand across the surface. Alice saw his fingers touch a small photograph hidden behind the shards of glass. Her heart stopped when he pulled out the photo and threw it on the table. It was her own picture taken long before that day. Beneath the photo was a caption that froze her blood. Next stage. You're not supposed to know more than you've been allowed, he said, his voice now not calm but almost hissing. Douglas grabbed her by the arm and forcefully pushed her back toward the mattress. The lock on the door clicked, and she was left alone. Alice sat there, staring at the photo, trying to cope with the wave of fear. Her despair peaked, but with it came her resolve. She knew one thing: waiting was no longer an option. Alice sat on the floor of the dark room, her heart pounding in her chest like a warning bell. All the memories of the past few days blurred together, and she couldn't tell where reality ended and the nightmare began. She knew she had to act, that every move she made had to be precise, flawless, but fear overtook her. The moment when she broke the lock and escaped from that horrible place felt distant, like it belonged to another world. But instead of the poisoned world Douglas had described, a forest lay before her. Dark, heavy, with strange silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind, almost alive. The nature around her seemed untouched, and she couldn't see any signs of catastrophe. But that made her uneasy. Why did this place feel so familiar? She kept walking until she saw the outline of a house. Its dark silhouette promised nothing good, and her instincts told her it was another trap. Just minutes ago, she had been running from Douglas, and now something deep inside her warned that this house was part of his plan. She cautiously approached the door and carefully opened it. Inside was a cold, dusty corridor that made her stop in her tracks. Dead silence, but even it felt so heavy that it seemed like everything around her would explode at any moment. Alice felt out of place here. This wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a place for experiments. Old papers stained with blood lay on the tables, scattered fragments of items that hinted at very old and brutal practices. She approached one of the tables and found several monitors showing security camera feeds. On the screens, she saw herself. They were watching her like an exhibit, and without a doubt, it was him, Douglas. Her heart was racing. She saw in the recordings how he had observed his victims. But this time, he wasn't just watching. He was creating real hell. All the people who had been here became part of his experiments. He made them experience horrors similar to the ones she had gone through. Forgetfulness, fear, the feeling that they had become mere pieces in his hands. And now she saw the proof that she wasn't alone. She was part of something much larger and more terrifying. The footage on the screens kept changing, each shot, each name, each situation growing more grotesque. This wasn't just a doctor. This was a maniac manipulating the minds of his patients, creating new and twisted scenarios. He chose people like her and inserted them into his warped experiments. He was part of a conspiracy, part of a plan that seemed endless. As she watched, Alice understood that nothing here was random. Her life wasn't just a series of coincidences. It was part of his grand game, part of his plan that she still didn't fully understand. But now, as the truth began to unfold, she felt a real terror when she realized. He knew she was here. The door swung open. Douglas entered the room. His expression was calm, almost ruthlessly calm, but there was a fury burning in his eyes that was hard to miss. "You shouldn't have seen this." His voice was even, but there was a cold threat in it. "You shouldn't have learned the truth." Alice knew she couldn't wait any longer. Her legs were shaking, but she stood up, grabbing the first thing she could find. She realized that if she stayed here, he would destroy her. She rushed toward the door, but it slammed shut right in front of her. Despair pierced her. Douglas was closing in, and her heart raced faster, but she couldn't stop now. Her hands scrambled for an escape, for any chance to flee. She had no other choice. The whole room seemed to freeze. Douglas glanced at her, and on his face was something even more terrifying: indifference, a look that tore her apart. Then she understood. This wasn't a trap. This was a hunt, and she had become part of his cruel game. The darkness of the night was all-encompassing, but Alice couldn't stop. Douglas was close, and his steps, those ominous, relentless steps, grew louder with every moment. He was in his element, hunting her down like a predator who had already tasted victory. Her breath grew heavier, weighed down by the pain in her legs and the constant tension in her body. The knife she still clutched tightly in her hands was her only hope. She gripped the handle, summoning every last ounce of strength, and moved forward, trying to keep calm. But each step felt like a puncture through her pain, and her skin tore from scratches and branches. Then, in an instant, she heard his voice, calm, yet chilling. "You won't escape, Alice. You can't hide from me." Suddenly, in the darkness, Douglas's silhouette appeared. He stood a few meters away, calm, a smile on his face, as if the whole situation was nothing more than a game to him. He approached slowly, but his steps were careful, preventing her from running. Alice had no choice. Desperation drove her as she lunged at him, knife in hand. In her heart, rage and the will to survive burned, a fierce desire to do anything to escape this nightmare. Douglas, initially confident, didn't expect her to be so determined. He dodged her strike, but she rushed forward again. The blade struck his arm, and blood splattered into the dark. Douglas flinched in pain, but he didn't retreat. His eyes clouded with fury. "These are all your illusions, Alice," he said, shoving her back. But she didn't stop. Blood dripped from his wound, and she felt her every movement fueled by new strength. She lunged at him once more, and this time her knife struck his chest, piercing the fabric of his jacket. Douglas staggered back, but she struck again, this time more precisely. Yet he was still alive. There was something strange in his eyes. Nothing human, just twisted anger and pain, and his hands reached out to grab her throat. They fought, shoving each other, each movement filled with ruthless strength. Blood from their bodies mixed with the earth, and it was impossible to tell where one person ended and the other began. They fell to the ground. He tried to turn the knife on her, but she was still stronger, still driven by one goal: escape. Suddenly, Douglas grabbed her hand again, pushing her back, and in that moment, she felt all her strength draining from her. She fell to the ground, her chest heaving with each painful breath, her skin slick with sweat and blood. But no, she couldn't give up. This was her last chance. She remembered the knife. She turned it in her hands, pushing every last bit of strength into it. And this blow was the final one, precise and fatal. Douglas collapsed to the ground, his eyes frozen in disbelief, and his face no longer held any trace of the confidence he once had. He still breathed, but with each passing second, his movements slowed. His hands fell, and red foam leaked from his mouth. Alice recoiled from him, breathing heavily. She stood there, stunned, her hands torn and covered in blood. Douglas was dead, and she had escaped. She did it, but, looking at his lifeless body, she knew her fight was far from over. The distance between her and the world she thought she understood was far greater than she could have imagined. And despite the victory, fear lingered within her, because this was only the beginning of something far worse. Something bigger than Douglas. Something bigger than her fight for survival. She fell to the ground, her heart pounding wildly, but there was no time to rest. She had to keep going. Alice could barely stand, her breathing heavy, and blood still dripping from her cuts. Only her exhausted, distorted thoughts pushed her forward, and feeling this was her only hope, she rushed toward the road. Behind her, the sound of footsteps echoed, but she couldn't look back. A car's headlights pierced through the darkness, promising salvation. The car screeched to a halt, and a middle-aged man stepped out, his face cold, emotionless. His gaze was indifferent, as though her appearance didn't surprise him in the slightest. "What happened?" he asked, as if it were an ordinary question. Alice, trying to gather the last of her strength, quickly began to recount what had happened. She didn't have time for the details. About Douglas, the horrors she had faced, her struggle for freedom. Her words tumbled out, but she tried to express the important parts. The man stood there listening like stone. And then something changed. There was no sympathy in his eyes now, only cold indifference. He pulled out a phone, ignoring her, and quietly said, "We found another one." These words opened a terrifying abyss within Alice's soul. She realized what she thought was rescue was, in fact, another trap. Two men in medical uniforms appeared behind her. They moved smoothly, without haste, as if they had been prepared for this moment for a long time. Her desperate attempts to break free were futile. They lifted her, grabbing her arms and legs, disregarding her protests, and dragged her to the car. "We're not competitors of Douglas," one of the men said, almost emotionlessly. "We're part of him. Another part. The network needs to expand. We take the ones he tracks and turn them into valuable assets." In that moment, Alice understood it wasn't a coincidence. These weren't random people who just happened to be in her way. They worked with Douglas, but their methods were different. They found victims, tracked them, and took those he no longer needed, or those who could become part of their operation. She was just one link in their brutal, merciless network. They threw her into the car, slamming the doors shut. She no longer had the strength to scream, her hopes of salvation gone. She had fallen into the hands of new overseers, just as merciless as Douglas. And though she still held on to the hope of escaping, deep down she knew. Now she was part of this trap, one she could never escape. The car sped off into the darkness, leaving only a shadow on the road. Like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments about this story. Your opinions mean a lot to me, and remember, even when it seems like it's all over, there are still those who continue to play by their own rules, and not every escapee finds true salvation.